Somewhere Else is a podcast about the people who move and the world that moves them. Every episode, we sit down with historians, economists, journalists, attorneys, and people with lived experience to explore the forces political, economic, human that shape why people leave, where they go, and what they find when they get there. This is immigration, but deeper. Somewhere else. The views and opinions expressed in this episode are those of our guest alone and do not represent the position of Somewhere Else, Immigrate, or any affiliated organization. Nothing you hear in this podcast constitutes legal advice. For guidance specific to your situation, please consult a qualified immigration attorney. We're living through a period of aggressive immigration enforcement in the United States. From your perspective, as someone who studies migration patterns, what do enforcement-heavy policies actually do to migration flows? Do you think they work? Or do they work?
Well, do you remember that scene in Jurassic Park when Jeff Goldblum says, nature always finds a way? Well, the same thing happens with immigration. Immigration always finds a way.
Today, we want to present you something that almost no one wants to say out loud in this debate. Why do people really migrate? Not the version politicians use, not the version that fits in a headline, the real one. The one backed by decades of data, economic research, and history. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Most people don't migrate because they want to. They migrate because they have no real choice. That's why we're talking about today. And I think by the end of this conversation, you're going to see this issue very differently. Welcome to Somewhere Else. This is a podcast about the people who move and the world that moves them. Immigration is where we start, but the territory is much bigger. The economics, the history, the politics, the human decisions that happen long before anyone crosses a border. I'm José Gallardo, and today I have with me someone who has spent her career at the intersection of international relations, human rights, and policy. Andrea Balda holds a PhD in international relations and business, a master's in international relations, human rights, and conflict resolution, and a bachelor's from Johns Hopkins University. She is one of the few people who can take a topic that has been reduced to a political argument and turn it back into what it actually is, a human story with data and a history behind it. Andrea, welcome to Somewhere Else.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here with you. That's a very kind introduction. Just a small precision. I'm a PhD candidate. I still haven't defended my thesis. I'm on my way. And it's actually on immigration and international relations. So, we're going to have a good conversation.
Thank you very much for that clarification. So a future PhD.
Yes, hopefully.
Awesome. Well, welcome to our podcast. Before we get into it, this episode is brought to you by Migrate, Immigration Support Services. Because every journey deserves a clear path, whether you're navigating a visa, organizing your documents, or simply trying to understand what comes next. Migrate provides the structured support and guidance you need every step of the way. No confusion, no overwhelm, just clarity to move forward. Visit their social media at immigrate.iss and book a free consultation. Now, let's talk about why people really move. We are aware that immigration is one of the most misunderstood phenomena of our time. We hear about it every day in the news, in the political debate, on social media, but almost nobody asks the fundamental question. Why has migration always existed? And why does it look the way it does today? Let's start there, Andrea.
That's a great question. And it is, in fact, a very misunderstood topic because we tend to think about immigration as abnormal or crisis-driven, and actually sedentariness is or has been the norm. Sedentariness is a historical anomaly. The norm is actually to move around. Humans have been moving around the world way before states actually existed. So when we think about immigration, that's actually the norm. That's what humans are supposed to do. And we tend to think about immigration today from a Eurocentric point of view, or influenced by the American ideal of immigration. People tend to follow the American dream and they immigrate in search of a better life. But actually, immigration tracks structural differentials. People move because of wage gaps, people move because they are seeking the protection and the respect of the human rights. They move because of demographic asymmetries, labor demand, even climate change is a variable for immigration. So when we think about migration, we're not talking about individual whims. We're talking about um, a model that actually tracks with the origin of humanity. This is what people have been doing for ever since they have existed. They've been moving along.
Right. It makes so much sense to think about how sedentarism is the exception, it's not the norm, like you say. Um, and have you, during your studies and career, have you been able to identify patterns that tell us why people move? Is there a pattern to why people throughout history, over the last recent decades, or since the beginning of time, what can those patterns be?
Well, there are not really patterns. What we can see, though, is that immigration tends to follow structural variables. So, movement just follows better policy. And immigration policies that ignore this structure is just fighting against gravity. Immigrants will follow and will move and will seek countries that offer better opportunities for them in the specific aspect they're looking to change their lives in.
And what could be a common misconception about those aspects that you mentioned? Is there maybe some sort of dialogue that we might assume when thinking about migration, like a specific reason why people move? Is there any misconceptions that you could tell us about?
Yes, people tend to think immigration just follows an economic logic. And what we have even now, at this specific point in history, we're living through a time where we have the most active conflicts in the history of the world right now. So immigration doesn't really follow the economic logic. People don't really move because they're looking for a better uh, economic condition. They're not only looking for better salaries, they're actually looking for better lives and they're better conditions. They want to wake up in a place that's not being bombed. They want to wake up in
Right.
a place where they're not being persecuted. They want to wake up in a place where they're not being arrested for being in the political opposition, and they want to live in a place where they can actually vote and be free and walk in the streets without fear of being persecuted. So when we think about immigration, it's not really an economic decision. It's a life decision based on wanting to improve and wanting to have the conditions that normally we associate with living a better life.
You mentioned economic factors. Let's go deeper there. There's a popular, I would say, common argument that immigrants come and take jobs or drain resources
Yes.
once they arrive to their destination. What does the economic research actually say about that point?
Yeah, that's one of the biggest misconceptions about immigration. Labor markets are not zero sum games. Immigrants actually come in, they expand demand, they fill complementary roles. When we have the narrative of immigrants taking away jobs, most of the jobs immigrants come in and fill are informal jobs or jobs in the informal sector. So these are jobs that are not being handled by the host community, and they raise productivity. When we think about, for example, Venezuelan immigrants in Ecuador, um, one of the biggest factors when we think about job taking is education. And what tends to happen is, especially when you think about South-South South-South regional immigration in Latin America, we have immigrants coming in countries where immigrants actually have higher levels of education than or compared to the median host population. So the idea of job taking maybe stems from there, but it's because they're better prepared, not because they're immigrants per se.
I see. That's such an interesting point. I'm curious about, and I'm sure our listeners and audience also wonder, how would an immigrant then contribute to those economies that they are inserting themselves in? So once the immigrant arrives to their destination or to their host country, what does the data say about their contributions to the local economies?
Well, if when we think about the data aspect of it, they dynamize these economies. They bring better practices or different practices from other places. They insert new cultural aspects to markets that were dealing with these aspects beforehand. So they just they inject change in markets that were more or less stagnant. And the best example of this comes from Latin American immigration in
Yes.
Latin America itself, not necessarily the United States. Um, and the interesting thing about South-South migration in Latin America is that you have these uh, economies that exclude a large portion of the population, and then immigrants trying to include themselves in this system that is structurally exclusive. Um,
I-
and they do so very creatively, and they carve niche markets for themselves, and by
Right.
doing so they dynamize specific sectors of these markets that weren't there before. So by doing that, and only by doing that, they just inject change in markets that were stagnant in and of themselves. Sorry.
No, thank you. That really widens my view of immigration, and I've heard throughout the years and through some studies as well the notion of remittances. And now that you mentioned these
Yes.
economic factors, how important or how valuable would you say these remittances are in the migration experience, even within Latin America,
They
like you mentioned?
they were incredibly important. And if you think about immigration in the 80s and 90s, for example, remittances were a large part of the reason why immigrants stayed away from their homes. They would contribute. There was a point in El Salvador, for example, where 90% of the country's income came from remittances. So
Wow.
remittances were a large portion of, yes, so remittances were a large portion of dynamizing these economies from home. And then when we think about Ecuador, for example, it's one of the reasons why Ecuador became uh, an interesting host country for immigration, because you gain in dollars, so that the
Yeah.
money was, going back home and then uh, benefiting from the exchange rate. So remittances is a large part. It's still a large part of the reason why people immigrate, in order to contribute to their economies back home.
Of
And
course.
again, it dynamizes the economy. It helps the host country as well. So it's kind of a circular benefit.
Right, right. They're not only working towards their economies, but those remittances usually come back to their families, right? They usually come back to their own
Exactly.
communities, and they help even dynamize the local economies of their origin countries, if that makes sense.
Yes, and then one other interesting thing happens with remittances is that it keeps the connection between the immigrant and his host country. So when we think about identity-wise, remittances keeps the connection flowing. So that's also an interesting aspect of remittances. It's not only the economic factor, but it keeps you in close contact with whatever's going on in your country, politically, socially, and then with your family as well.
That was my question there. This connection that you're talking about, would you say is like an identity connection, a cultural connection, maybe I don't know, a romantic. I don't mean romantic as a relationship. I mean towards the
No, I
culture.
get what you mean.
Yes.
Actually, yes. Yes, when we think about immigration, and we think about the nexus between immigration and identity, and what happens with the your local identity, and how you wrestle with being an immigrant in a new country and trying to adopt and integrate yourself into this new country, and then keeping your own culture and your own language and your it's very complicated for an immigrant to surf, that wave. And then
Right.
countries need to do a lot to integrate these immigrants into their own community. But remittance is actually an interesting way to keep that connection flowing, because it forces you to uh, keep, on top of whatever's going on in your host country, because you're going to
Right.
have to send more or less money back home
Right.
depending
Right.
on
Right.
whatever's going on. But yeah, you are right. There is this intimate, very personal connection with your country whenever you immigrate. And it's one of the better studied parts of immigration, whatever happens with national identities, and how you wrestle having both identities surviving within one person.
I remember in my own experience, because I've also studied abroad in the U.S. The notion of Latin American community. Once you migrate to the United States or a different country where usually Spanish is not the most spoken language, if you hear someone speak Spanish, you immediately go like, "Oh, where are you from?"
Yeah, you're
And
like, wait.
yeah,
Yeah,
like
yeah,
where are
yeah.
you from? Oh, you're from Argentina. I'm from Ecuador. And those type of relationships sometimes they wouldn't naturally develop within Latin America, but once you're outside Latin America, then everyone becomes a community. I find it fascinating. Um,
Yeah,
and one
community is a powerful thing.
It is. I agree. And one thing that strikes me about all of this data that we've been discussing is that immigration then doesn't really sound like a choice in the way that we usually frame it. How do you think about the concept of choice when it comes to immigration? Perhaps the main reasons that you've studied, or is it true? Is it a little? Is there some truth to it? What do you think? What do you know?
I mean, it's only a choice as long as you have the opportunity to actually choose. In most countries, especially when we think about immigration as a conflict-driven thing, even though it's not one of the only reasons people immigrate, then it's not really a choice, is it?
Right.
So yes, I mean, even if you actually do have to end up making that decision of leaving your life behind in another country and moving somewhere else, it's only a choice as long as you actually do have an opportunity set to choose from.
So perhaps the word choice is a little bit out of place here. I'm thinking about perhaps forced and voluntary. Would you change the language a bit to better address this idea or notion of migration as perhaps a last resource to escape from, like you were mentioning at the beginning, political persecution or economic hardship? Perhaps voluntary and forced is a little bit more appropriate, would you say?
Yeah, and the thing is, it might seem that we're arguing semantics here, but then again, these are very powerful words. And
Yes.
when we think about migratory policy, these words, semantics, make all the difference because
I, I
you can
bet,
either
yes.
be a political immigrant or a refugee, or be granted political asylum depending on semantics. So yes, voluntary is a powerful word, and then forced migration is an incredibly powerful word. When we think about forced migration, for example, and we tend to think, or we associate this with Venezuelan immigration in Latin America, and for a long time, depending on the host country's political ideology, Venezuelan immigrants weren't seen as forced migrants, only as economic immigrants. So they weren't granted refugee status in many countries in Latin America because
Right.
of that. So, it may seem that we're arguing semantics, but, semantics are powerful in the end as well.
Absolutely. I am a big advocate for the importance of semantics. um, but not removing semantics, but besides semantics, can you share with us and our audience perhaps an observed example of this case that you've studied throughout the years? An example of a person or a group of people. I know you've recently been really deep into Venezuelan migration throughout Latin America. So,
Yes.
um, how does the semantics apply to perhaps those communities or individuals?
Yes, that's a great question. When we think about Ecuador and thinking about Ecuadorian um, immigration policy, Ecuador has, it has traveled a path um, with a lot of changes in its own immigration policy. Ecuador started out around 2008 with a very migration forward constitution, where it granted the status of human rights to immigration, and it believed that migrants, people had the right to move around. And then it slowly but surely started adopting a security focused view on immigration. And it started making a lot of changes in its immigration policy, obviously not constitution wise, but pertaining to its Ley Orgánica de Movilidad Humana, and it's
Right.
been hardening its views on immigration, and it all stems because of the utilitarian nexus between immigration and job insecurity, or immigration and insecurity as a whole. And this view follows an international trend where we have seen different countries, the United States, the EU, and I think we've mentioned this earlier in the program, that have been hardening their migratory policies as well. So Ecuador has traversed this road in the past 10, 15 years, and it's affected Venezuelan immigration specifically. Why? Because Ecuador was and has been for the past years in the top, within the top three countries receiving Venezuelan immigrants. First, because it was very easy for them to come into the country. Then
Mhm.
Ecuador created visas that facilitated a regular entry, and then it cut those programs short. So
Right.
it has traversed the path uh, between being very open to immigration to closing its borders to that type of immigration as well.
What I can gather from that is that these individual experiences are really affected by judicial decisions or political decisions that happen in our case, Ecuador. I want to touch back on that right after this short break, um, and get back into how politicians, perhaps, or the politics of a nation affect the experiences of the migrants that we've been talking about. Thank you, Andrea, for sharing all of this information with us. Let's come back in a second.
Happy to.
Moving forward in an immigration process requires more than hope. It requires preparation, documentation, understanding the system, and knowing that you don't have to navigate it alone. For help and advice, contact Immigrate on their social media at immigrate.iss. We're back here with Andrea. Thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. Migration is not a trend. It is not a crisis invented by politicians. It is a human response, like you've been telling us, to economic and historical forces. And that changes the entire conversation. So let's go there next. Immigrants tend to make some the same mistakes, and we as a society make an even bigger one. We treat migration as a problem to be solved when history shows it has always been a condition to be managed. So, what does that look like in 2026? What is actually happening, not in the political debate, but in the data, in the courts, in the lives of real people? We're living through a period of aggressive immigration enforcement in the United States. From your perspective, as someone who studies migration patterns, what do enforcement heavy policies actually do to migration flows? Do you think they work, or do they work?
Well, do you remember that scene in Jurassic Park when Jeff Goldblum says, nature always finds a way? Well, the
Yeah.
same thing happens with immigration. Immigration always finds a way. What happens with the harsh enforcement of migration policies is that you they either succeed in deterring the flow of immigration, or they just redirect the flow. Harsh enforcement actually just almost never ends up reducing aggregate immigration. It just reshapes how immigration looks like. And when we think about how harsh immigration policies in the US have affected immigration, we tend to think about, the externalization of immigration points. Now, you don't have bottlenecks in Mexico, between Mexico and the United States, but you have them between Mexico and the rest of Central America, or the Darien Gap, for example, people starting to immigrate way down south and then working their way up, or working their way down from Canada. Or when we think about the EU, we used to think about cayucos trying to make their way to the Canaries in Spain, and now we have them, trying to enter from Greece, trying to enter from France, trying to work their way through Asia. So we have the redirection of routes, and not really the reduction of immigration. So harsh enforcement policies rarely do have the effect people think they're gonna have.
Makes. But does would you say enforcement send a message to those people perhaps trying to migrate towards the United States in this case?
Yes, of course, it does send a message. And in the case of the United States, it was a very well compounded message. I mean, they literally said, please don't come. You're going to get deported. And the EU is actually saying the exact same thing. They're working towards externalizing um, the administrative aspects of immigration and outside borders from the EU. So yes, the message is please do not come. We're evaluating your visas a lot more extensively. So yes, it does send a message, but at the same time, people do still have the same needs they used to have before, and even more so today when we have all these live conflicts going on
Right.
at the same time. So it doesn't really change the need for migration. It just changes the way you're going about it.
It is important then, I would say, to make sure those needs are being met, and that anyone trying to migrate is getting the right information to complete those processes. Let's talk about precisely that: the people that are already inside the system or are trying to work inside the system, through the system. There are millions of undocumented individuals in the United States, many of whom have been here for decades or have families, they've built their own lives. What does the research tell us about this population? Who are they really, this undocumented population in the United States?
Mostly they are people, with a high labor force participation. They have, a long tenured existence in the United States. Most of them have been in the country for, or have been residents in the country for more than 5 years, even more in other situations. Most of them have mixed family status. They have family members who are citizens of the United States, and that's what drew them to the country to begin with. Um, and a lot of them actually, you know, some of them were born in the country to begin with. They were just born to um, irregular, parents with an irregular migratory status. A lot of them are visa overstays as well. When we think about immigration in the case of the United States, visa overstays actually rival unauthorized crossings at this point in U.S. history. So, yeah, when we think about immigration, walls don't really keep immigrants out.
Yeah, I think if you think about it, I would say most of us living in Latin America have a family member that was born in the US or Europe or anywhere outside of the country. And even though they're your cousin, perhaps, you feel like they are from a different country because they are. That's the country that they know. Um, so the people in the systems are not abstractions, right? They are not a policy problem waiting to be solved. They are people who made a decision or had a decision made for them under conditions most of us will never face. And the system they're navigating is one of the most complex legal and administrative environments in the world. So so what does moving forward actually look like? Uh, what happens next after you're already in this situation?
That's
That's
a great question when we think about. Sorry, what? Go ahead.
no, please, you go.
When we think about immigrants, we think about homogenous communities, and immigrants are incredibly heterogeneous. So when we think about what we go from there, we're thinking about being undocumented is a legal status, not a population type, and immigrants flow within various aspects of types of population. So when we think about integration models, we need to take this into account, and that's where you go from there, policy wise. And it depends on the country you're thinking of, but yeah, that's where we go from there. That's where you build up from.
And when you look at the countries that have managed migration well, let's say, historically or in the present, what have these countries or nations done differently that has uh, perhaps facilitated a more efficient migration, or I would say even a more humane migration, a more empathic migration?
Yeah, and then we have to question what that looks like, because normally when we think about states that have managed migration adequately, we think about states that offer legal pathways to a regular status, and then at the same time couple that legal pathway with integration capacity, and then a welcoming public narrative. For example, when we think about the integration of Venezuelan immigrants, we can take Colombia as an example, or even Ecuador as an example, because both offered, specific legal pathways for Venezuelan immigrants. Colombia continues to offer them, Ecuador doesn't anymore. But then they also have or used to have integration programs for that specific community. And when you think about integration, integration sounds a lot like economic inclusion in the case of Latin America. But when we think about integration in other countries like the US or even regions like the EU, integration also stands for, social inclusion, culture, language, religion.
Right.
It's a very complex process that has to take a lot of things into account. That's why it's important to think about immigrants and the immigrant community as a heterogeneous population, because there are a lot of very different aspects that are going to have to be, integrated into the host community if it's going to be done well.
I'd say there's no simple answers to any of these questions because, each person is a whole world. Um, so, last big question before we close. When you look at the next 10 years of migration to the United States specifically, what do you see? What forces are building that most people perhaps are not paying attention to at the moment when it comes to the next 10 years?
Maybe, aging population.
Uh,
What we're looking at right now is a tendency towards hardening migratory policy in different countries and, worldwide. And a lot of these countries are, have aging population, and they're going to need immigration later on in order to maintain their
health.
social service centered state and welfare state model. So, this is something we're not really looking at right now, and people are not, it's not top of mind when we think about immigration, and it's not necessarily top of mind because it's not, politically sellable right now.
Or
But it's
relevant.
something that most countries are going to have to think about later on. And then, climate displacement as a source of immigration is also something that's going to, be big in a couple of years. And
Mhm.
there's some discussion happening right now on climate as, a displacement factor, but I think it's going to be bigger, as climate change progresses.
Thank you so much for sharing this eye-opening information, really. Let's take a quick last break, and when we come back, we'll wrap up this conversation. To close this very interesting conversation that we've been having, Andrea, let's do a quick fire 3 questions on the topic that we've been discussing. Uh, Here are the questions that I have for you. Question number 1. Is there a moment in history, a policy, a decision, a border drawn on a map that you think about often and wish had gone differently?
I'm not going to say I think about it often, but I am an Ecuadorian and I do have a lot of Peruvian family. So sorry, Peru, but ni un paso atrás. Maybe that one comes to mind.
Immediately, okay, ni un paso atrás. Quick question number 2. What is the conversation about migration that no one wants to have, but that everyone needs to hear?
I think the one that we just mentioned a couple of moments ago, that the idea that these countries that are enforcing harsh uh, migratory policy are going to need immigrants if they're going to, sustain their welfare model. So the debate is actually performative. They need immigration.
Wow, that is such a interesting and valid point that I wish we had time to expand on perhaps another occasion. Question number 3 and last question. What would you say to someone who is thinking about migrating tonight in the next 12 hours?
A lot of patience is going to be needed in every single aspect, because immigration is a lot more than administrative issues, and you're going to have to deal with a lot of them. It entails a lot of sacrifice, and it entails a lot of patience with the people around you as well, and the people that travel with you. So prepare yourself. It's a lot of work, but in the end, it should pay off.
Awesome. Great. Great advice for those people trying to or experiencing migration from the start today. To finish today's episode, what we've explored today is not a political argument, it's an invitation to see a human reality more clearly. People move because the world moves them, and the least we can do as individuals, as communities, and as a society is understand why before we decide what to do about it. So, again, Andrea, thank you very much for being a part of this conversation. This is exactly the kind of conversations that we're trying to have in this program.
Thank you very much for having me. Immigration is a topic very close to my heart. So, I appreciate any chance I get to expand on it. Thank you.
Thank you. And to everyone listening, if today's conversation made you think about your own situation, your own process, your own next step, the next part of this is knowing what to do with that. So we have something for that too. Today's episode is brought to you by Immigrate, Immigration Support Services. If today's conversation made you think about your own immigration process, Immigrate is here to help you organize your case, understand the next steps, and move forward with clarity and confidence. Visit our social media or send us a message. We will help you figure out where you stand. This has been Somewhere Else. I am José Gallardo, and we'll see you next time.